The NFL is going to have a busy week this week in Indianapolis at the NFL Combine, but business at home will also continue. What are some things the Dolphins need to be mindful of as looking to extend some of their own players set to hit free agency?
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I am your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. We don't just say it, we live it. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Welcome to Locked On Dolphins. I am not at home if you're watching on YouTube. I am in my hotel room in Indianapolis for the NFL Combine. Mike McDaniel's going to speak today at 1 o'clock. I'll be at the podium session. I'll have a chance to hopefully ask him a question or two as a part of that and kind of get the update from Miami's side of the fence. But the one thing that's going to happen this week quite a bit is you're going to see teams making their personnel moves necessary to become salary cap compliant. The Dolphins obviously started this already with the designation of a post-June 1st cut for Xavier Howard, which will be formalized when that cut is announced by the team, and Emmanuel Ogbah being cut and saving about $14 million in cap space. The Dolphins are well on their way. They're going to get there and be just fine. But they have their own players that are expiring contracts that I think it's going to be very strategic. It's going to have to be very strategic for Miami because there are certain positions across the board that I look at, and you see the players that are available, not just for the Dolphins, but for the entirety of the league. And you understand there's an opportunity to get similar play for a much more cost-effective dollar amount, i.e. Emmanuel Ogbah is the extreme example of that. But then also there's other positions where you don't have a surplus or a number of options that paint a rosy picture for what your alternative pathways could look like. And you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. The number one thing that I think teams have to avoid in order to ensure they are consistently drafting well is not painting themselves into a corner and say, oh, well, we need to pick this position early in the draft. Because once you start drafting for need, that becomes a very slippery slope. And one of the more notorious examples of that in recent memory is the Tennessee Titans. John Robinson, always, the former general manager, always drafted for need. And that's how you get Isaiah Wilson in the first round. Right? It's the tackle run happens and you say, well, we need a tackle, so we just gonna have to draft a tackle. That's what you want to avoid. So as I'm Miami and as I'm looking at my own free agents, I'm asking myself, okay, where do I have flexibility to make an offer if I want to bring the player back, but then know if I don't bring the player back on my price, I'm going to have other opportunities elsewhere across the space to kind of avoid being painted into a corner. So let's recap right now Miami's free agents of note. Connor Williams, Robert Hunt on the offensive line, Christian Wilkins, Andrew Van Ginkel on the defensive line. And beyond this point, you have meaningful contributors, guys that played meaningful snaps for you. Deshaun Elliott is the highest snap taker on the team. That's set to be an expiring free agent, signed on a $1.7 million deal, 1-year contract. Kendall Lamb is a swing tackle, played over half the snaps for you. Wide receivers, Braxton Berrios, Cedric Wilson, Chase Claypool, River Craycraft are all expiring contracts. Robbie Chosen's also in that bucket as well. Your edge group includes all of the veterans beyond Van Ginkel and Ogbah, who's already been cut and will not be back. But Bruce Irvin and Melvin Ingram and Justin Houston, you have injuries to the top two guys. There's going to be some needs there. For the Dolphins, they have a budget that other teams don't. So finding the pools of talent that exist is really critical for the team. And we'll do our first offensive player, right? And that's Connor Williams. When I look at the free agent market, and a lot of people want to draft Jackson Powers Johnson, the center from Oregon, or potentially Cedric Van Pran from Georgia, or Zach Frazier from West Virginia. And like, that's great. Graham Barton from Duke. It's good to have that aspiration. Is the question you have to ask yourself is Liam Eichenberg an acceptable only other alternative? Yes or no? Before the draft comes, yes or no? If the answer for you is yes, then okay. Like, if you're not going to have Connor back at his price point, then say la vie, right? We'll see you later. And we'll let the board fall how it will for the Dolphins in April. But if Liam Eichenberg being the only other center option, I know how everybody feels about Liam Eichenberg. Hello? So if the answer is no, that's not an acceptable only other alternative, then looking across and asking, okay, is there depth available for center eligible players in free agency in this year's class that would give you a more cost-effective veteran option than Connor Williams? That's a top of market type contract. And what percentage of player are you going to get there? And the answer at center is yes. Some of the centers that I have graded that are adequate starters to Lloyd Cushenberry is a quality start. Let's start there for the Denver Broncos. I think he's probably the second center on the market behind Connor. But adequate level starters that exist include Andre James for the Las Vegas Raiders, Coleman Shelton with the Los Angeles Rams, Tyler Biadasz with the Dallas Cowboys. I think all three of those are adequate level starters. And then you have quality depth players like at this stage in his career, Brian Allen and Mason Cole. I don't think Brian Allen or Mason Cole solves your position altogether. I think Andre James could. I think Coleman Shelton potentially could. So you have options for, we want to close the door on a starting center, or we want to provide another versatile option and then see what happens in April. And maybe they can do both if they're drafting a offensive lineman like Graham Barton or Jackson Powers Johnson, who could also play guard. But the point is, we have multiple starters that should be available. You have multiple depth players who should be available. So if Connor Williams doesn't want to sign a contract that's within whatever Miami's budget for him would be, then you sit here and you rest easy knowing that you have other positions and directions that you can go. And that's the theory we're applying to all of the players that we're going to talk about here today on the show, is finding how deep is the pool behind them to find the alternative within your budget. We're going to talk Robert Hunt next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so make sure that you stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time is unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and how you can make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with licensed therapists and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to take the time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Robert Hunt is the big fish, one of the big fish. I think Miami technically has two with him and Christian. Now they can slam the door shut on one of these. Not that the franchise tag makes sense for Robert Hunt, because for whatever reason, the NFLPA said we're going to pool all offensive linemen together for franchise tag total. So there's one offensive line total. There's guards and centers get the same franchise tag total as tackles, which makes it very unattractive to tag a guard. And Miami won't. Let's just be clear there. But Robert Hunt, potentially looking to maximize his value, this is one of the positions where I feel even more strongly than I do at center. There's options at guard. And do I think the Dolphins are going to pay multiple guards? No, I don't. But there are a lot of options with offensive guard, some of which I think are very high-quality options and could be quality starters. Is Damian Lewis from the Seattle Seahawks at, I don't know, 70% of the cost, even 80% of the cost? Is it a better option for Miami than retaining Robert Hunt? Maybe. I'd entertain the conversation. I have an emotional attachment to Robert Hunt because he was a part of that 2020 draft class, and he's been here, and he's been awesome. But if I remove the emotional attachment to Robert Hunt and I say just objectively, is Robert Hunt $6 million a year more better than Damian Lewis? I don't think my answer is yes. And for Miami, $6 million is a lot of money when you're operating on a budget. If you want a more short-term answer, I think Kevin Zeitler from the Baltimore Ravens is a very attractive option on a short-term stint. John Simpson, another young player from Baltimore. I think Zeitler and Simpson, Zeitler at this stage of his career and Simpson, I think are both adequate starters. I think Damian Lewis in this scheme could be a quality starter. I think Robert Hunt is a quality starter, and I think he does have a cornerstone ceiling to tap into, but he has not put that all together just yet. But further down, guys that I think also qualify as adequate starters include Jonah Jackson from the Lions. There's been some injury issues there. Graham Glasgow with the Lions. Kevin Dotson. John Runyon Jr. is kind of a fringe adequate starter, quality depth type player. And once you get down a little further past that, I still have to do a couple new additions. Laken Tomlinson, it was announced yesterday, has been cut is going to be cut from the New York Jets. He obviously signed a $13+ million per year season contract with the Jets 2 years ago when he signed there, and has not lived up to that in any capacity. But coming back to the system that he was so successful in San Francisco with Mike McDaniel at a reduced cost, $5 million a year, something in that stratosphere, I don't think he's going to have a very robust market. That is another position like center where I have my offer for Robert Hunt, and I cannot let the emotions of Robert Hunt being here for the past 4 years as a Miami Dolphin and drafting and developing Robert Hunt allow the perspective to get skewed in my mind. And I want Robert Hunt back. I desperately want Robert Hunt back. But it would be irresponsible for Miami to have an emotional knee-jerk reaction to overpay bidding against themselves with Robert Hunt when there is that deep of a pool and interior offensive line behind. Because I potentially sign two of these guys to start at left and right guard for the cost of potentially what Robert Hunt will get if he gets on the open market. And they'd be adequate starters for you. So it's this crux of you don't want to pay for depth, but you also want like a floor of starters across the board everywhere you look on the roster. That is kind of at the root of the decision-making process, I'm sure. Wide receiver, where we went through Berrios and Craycraft and Chosen and Claypool. This is a sufficient wide receiver crop. I think there's a lot of depth players at this stage. If there was one player I think could tap into a higher ceiling, it would probably be Darnell Mooney. I'm sure he will have an appetite to go somewhere after getting passed by DJ Moore on the depth chart this year after formerly being a 1,000-yard receiver, to go somewhere where he would not be the third option. So I think that's probably the blockade that you have for Miami. But the good news is the expiring contracts are not guys that are $10+ million a year players. Your most expensive guy on this list is Braxton Berrios at 3.5. So finding economic alternatives should be relatively easy, especially in the stratosphere of where these players rank versus their contemporaries, where Hollywood Brown is the Robbie Chosen type player that would then in turn allow you to free up Waddle and Hill to not always do the field stretching stuff. Right? That was in theory what Robbie Chosen was going to bring to the table. He didn't play a lot. Curtis Samuel is another shifty, could win against man coverage in the middle of the field type of player. Mooney, we already mentioned. I will say this, if you're looking for a upper middle class wide receiver, this is not the free agent crop to do it. So if you're going to want to go that direction to really take the resources that you had rolled up in wide receivers 3 through 6 on the depth chart previously, you aren't going to find that player in free agency, in my mind. As far as the rest of the expiring contracts for Miami on the offensive side of the ball, Tyler Kroft, like we're not really losing sleep over. Kendall Lamb's really the only other significant name of note. And I'm not including Isaiah Wynn here because I've kind of written off Isaiah Wynn where, you got 6 games out of Isaiah Wynn, and then the same thing that's happened to him for most every other year in his career happened again. But Kendall Lamb, you're looking for swing tackles. I have good news and I have bad news. I think you're in the right stratosphere because the Dolphins aren't looking for a starter, and that's good. Of all the expiring contracts and all of the offensive tackles that I've watched, and I've watched Tyron Smith, George Fant, Donovan Smith, Jonah Williams, Kendall Lamb, Mekhi Becton with the Jets, Trent Brown, Cameron Fleming, Jake Curhan, Chukwuma Okorafor. I still need to finish watching Yash Nijman from the Green Bay Packers, but like those are the tackles that I've watched. And guys that I think are adequate starters or higher at this stage in their personal careers is Tyron Smith, who will be back in Dallas, it sounds like. George Fant. Kendall Lamb was an adequate starter for the Dolphins last year, but he was the third tackle. All these other guys, Donovan Smith at this stage of his career, I think he's a depth player. Jonah Williams, I think his ceiling's an adequate starter, but he's coming off a first-round contract and probably going to want some nice money. Mekhi Becton might be a short-term option. Trent Brown, I think, is on his last legs. Do you trust Keon Smith enough to just give him that role and then see what you find at tackle? If you can't get Kendall Lamb back under contract, the easy thing to do is say, Kendall Lamb, we're going to double your salary, come back and play. If that's not enough, just understand like George Fant and Donovan Smith, like those kinds of guys, they're playing for $4 million. You had Kendall Lamb for 1.5. You had a really good economic value. So it's the inverse. There's a shortage at that position, and you had the really high economic value contract relative to performance, which kind of puts you in a defensive position. If I'm Miami, I want to get that one done really quick. I don't want to let him go test the market and see what other teams thought of his tape. We're going to do this same exercise looking at free agency over on the defensive side of the ball up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So stick with us. Get buckets over at FanDuel with your first bet on America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Defensively, we've acknowledged Christian Wilkins. I would say this about the free agent crop at defensive tackle. There are options, and they are pretty evenly spread out. Now, I don't think all of the options that would make sense for Miami are going to be put on the market. I look first and foremost at Leonard Williams with the Seattle Seahawks. They traded like significant draft capital to get him at the trade deadline. I would assume that means he's probably going to be back. They did make a scheme change. They did bring in Mike McDonald as the head coach. Does that impact that? I don't know. But it's certainly something to kind of just keep an eye on. Wilkins is one of probably 3 $20+ million year players on the market. Chris Jones with the Chiefs. His franchise tag total will be $32 million. They're not going to tag him at that cost, so he'll probably hit the open market, and whether he comes back to Kansas City or not, we'll find out. Justin Madubuike with the Ravens, double-digit sack guy inside, young player, probably going to get a really nice contract. And Christian Wilkins. But there's enough need for interior disruptors, and it's kind of one of the new age premium positions that I would expect the fact that there's several of those players to not hurt one another's values. Case in point, look at all the defensive tackles from last year and the contracts that they got that were all between 24 and 20, $21 million. The Bills actually did a really nice job getting Ed Oliver locked in for 17. A very team-friendly market. So that ship is sailed for Christian Wilkins. But if you're looking to make the decision on Christian Wilkins, you look a little further down in, and we've talked about the nose tackle type players on the show with DJ Reader and Jonathan Hankins and Grover Stewart. That doesn't help you because that's a Raekwon Davis decision. You have Daquan Jones with the Bills as an older player. You have Lawrence Guy, who the Patriots cut as a part of their youth movement. Those are the guys, really, for me, that aren't nose tackles. So there's overlap with where Christian Wilkins plays. That I think you could get adequate level starter reps from or better. So is Lawrence Guy and a rookie and a sufficient replacement pathway for Christian Wilkins? I don't know. That's their decision. That's what they're going to have to decide. But the nose tackle position is an entirely different conversation. And I think Raekwon Davis is a player relative to his performance that it will be fairly easy to find replacement level play. And that comes back to volume of snaps. And that comes back to what you do with those snaps. So if I want to bring Raekwon Davis back, I'll make him whatever my budgeted offer is for a rotational nose tackle. And that's a take it or leave it conversation. Whereas Christian Wilkins, probably out of all the guys we've talked about, Connor Williams, the wide receivers, Robert Hunt, Christian Wilkins has the most leverage because Christian Wilkins plays a high volume of snaps at an elite level. And the contingencies behind him with what the market is showing doesn't give you the warm and fuzzies for guys that can take those snaps. And letting him walk does paint you into a bit of a corner. On the edge with Andrew Van Ginkel and Emmanuel Ogbah, I would say this, whether it's fair to Emmanuel Ogbah with the injuries from the past few years and the scheme change or not, that was one of the most low-value contracts in the league, in my mind. For the price relative to the play, especially as the injuries piled up. And I understand he had some nice sack totals, 5.5 sacks or whatever it was. But that's a contract I think there's a great relief to be out of. And it will be very easy to find better play for this scheme for a fraction of the cost. And that's why it was a no-brainer move to move on from Emmanuel Ogbah. Now, Andrew Van Ginkel, we've talked about the pass rush specialists of Josh Uche and Bryce Huff relative to Andrew Van Ginkel. But I also think there's some depth to this class for more versatility. I don't think Miami's going to be in the market for any of the top guys. They shouldn't be, really. They have 2 top guys. And then if best player available in the draft happens to be an edge and you've addressed your needs appropriately, then go that route. I like Tyquan Lewis a lot from Indianapolis as a potential Ogbah replacement. I think you could probably get him for 1/3 of the cost of Emmanuel Ogbah, and you'd be getting a better player. Jadeveon Clowney and Andrew Van Ginkel are maybe in the same conversation. Clowney's got a little bit more versatility kick inside. He's probably a better run defender than Andrew Van Ginkel. Well, he is a better run defender than Andrew Van Ginkel. Van Ginkel's probably a better pure pass rusher, though. So Uche, Huff, Van Ginkel, Clowney, I think there's a lot there where you maybe have a price and don't feel super obligated. Even though that's another player like Robert Hunt that I would really love to have back. Whereas Agba, the decision's already been made, but I look at a guy like Tyquan Lewis for the Colts, and that's a name that makes a lot of sense to me. Deshaun Elliott, the last name that I want to bring up here. This is the most loaded, and I like Deshaun Elliott, and I want Deshaun Elliott back. But whatever they're going to budget for safety, offer it, and if he doesn't take it, don't lose any sleep. The amount of safeties that are in the same stratosphere as adequate level starters. I got 12 safeties. 12. And that includes Deshaun Elliott. But it also includes, and some of these guys are a little bit better fit versus others for what Miami's doing. Geno Stone is in this conversation. Darnell Savage with the Packers is in this conversation. Jordan Whitehead with the Jets is in this conversation. Julian Blackmon with the Colts. Jordan Fuller and John Johnson with the Rams. Eddie Jackson, who was cut by the Bears. Tashawn Gibson for the 49ers. J. Ron Curse with the Dallas Cowboys. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson with the Detroit Lions. And then Deshaun Elliott. Like some different strengths as players. But all players, relatively speaking. I didn't even mention Jeremy Chin. Who I think would be maybe more of a Brandon Jones type role replacement. But if I got literally a dozen safeties that I think are all separated by this much of a margin, make a fair offer to Deshaun Elliott. Let him make the decision. And if he doesn't want to do it, you've got a very robust market at safety. And that's going to help you make a cost-effective decision as you try to maximize and find equal or comparable performance or better performance in a more cost-effective way, because that's how the Dolphins have to approach this offseason. I hope you guys enjoyed this look at what the negotiation strategy would be. This is obviously a big part of the offseason blueprint, where I'm going to have a whole simulated offseason, all the decisions that I would make, try to value the players appropriately and make decisions in free agency. And these are the kinds of thoughts and ideas that I am working through in deciding who to prioritize and what to offer and what to budget before moving to the next phase. All of that content is going to be next week, but there's some final table setting that happens here and now before Mike McDaniel speaks today at 1:00, and we get into more of the NFL Combine stuff. So hope you guys enjoyed this peek. Kyle Krabs, keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Make it a good one, and I will talk to you all again later today after Mike McDaniel speaks.